Hello, welcome everyone to this afternoon's press briefing on special education in New Jersey. My name is Cassandra Etienne, Associate Director at the Center for Cooperative Media. Today's panel is part of our monthly Not Your Same Old Sources press briefings. And for those who are joining us for the first time, this series features experts from our Diverse Sources database, which is a publicly available list of experts of different races, ages, genders, and ethnicities, in an effort to encourage journalists to expand their Rolodexes and to be more inclusive in their reporting. Not Your Same Old Sources also supports ethnic and community media by facilitating access to newsmakers and government officials who can talk about issues that are timely and of importance to New Jerseyans. Today's conversation follows a recent executive order that triggered massive changes to the Department of Education and the transfer of special education oversight to the Department of Health and Human Services. Now, historically, the Education Department has enforced the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or the IDEA Act, protecting education rights for approximately 7.5 million children nationwide. And here in New Jersey, special education programs have received approximately 1.2 billion in support annually. Advocates are concerned that the decreased funding and decreased federal oversight could mean less accountability and uneven distribution of resources for vulnerable student populations. Welcome to today's panel, led by our host and moderator, Jessie Gómez of Chalkbeat Newark. Thanks again to everyone for joining us, and I'll turn it over now to our host, Jessie Gómez.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thanks so much for the introduction, Cassandra. My name is Jessie Gómez. Like Cassandra said, I am a reporter with Chalkbeat Newark, covering education in Newark and across the state. I also focus a lot on my reporting on special education and students with disabilities in Newark. And today I'm really excited to chat with our panelists who bring a wealth of experience and knowledge in this topic. And we'll chat a little bit more about the implications of federal changes at that level on into Newark and across the state as well. So first, let's go ahead and introduce our panelists. Carolyn, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Jessie. I'm pleased to be here. My name is Carolyn Hayer. I'm the Executive Director at SPAN Parent Advocacy Network. We're located across the state, but our primary office is in Newark, so we do a lot of work in Newark. We are the federally funded PTI, which is the Parent Training and Information Center. So we work very closely with the U.S. Department of Education. And in addition to being the PTI, Parent Training and Information Center, we have a multitude of other projects here at SPAN that focus on early childhood, family engagement, youth engagement. We do a lot of work around supporting families around health. We provide individual assistance, a lot of training, resources, and just partnering with families to help them to navigate systems across the state. So I think I'll have an opportunity to talk more, but I'll turn this over to Nina so she can introduce herself.
Yes. Hi, good afternoon. For those of you not familiar with Advocates for Children of New Jersey, we're an independent nonprofit organization focusing on education, child welfare issues, early education, infant toddler, maternal health issues. I am the education attorney here and have a grant to help parents who can't afford attorneys. So these are pro bono services across the state. I provide a variety of issues. I provide assistance in a variety of issues, mostly special education, but also things like discipline, bullying, bilingual education rights, homeless education rights, attendance, registration, mental health issues. And I do a lot of work with children who are involved with the child welfare system and can provide education advocacy assistance to the law guardians and other professionals who assist them. I also provide legal advice to professionals who are working with children directly who will call me and ask for assistance. I speak Spanish fluently, so I'm also able to assist Spanish-speaking parents. The range of services can be from giving advice. I always do a pretty extensive intake. So I'm able to either give some advice based upon that intake, or I'll get records and give parents advice regarding their records, help them write letters. Or my involvement could be more extensive, meaning that I can attend meetings with parents, go to a state mediation or a settlement conference. At ACNJ, we don't litigate, so I don't get involved if the issues can't be resolved informally. And then I create print materials and blogs regarding education law-related issues and provide conferences. And when I started here, like 18 years ago, I think, our numbers were, about 250 a year, 225, 250. Since the pandemic, those numbers have increased to 350, I think 360 this year. And so I definitely have to be more strategic. I can always give parents advice, but obviously those cases where I could go to a meeting or go to a mediation is limited by my availability. So many more people would like me to go to meetings that I'm able to, but I'm able to provide a lot of assistance through negotiating with attorneys and helping parents with letters and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you both for that introduction. You both do a lot of really extensive work with families across the state. Obviously, dealing with students with disabilities and the legalities of special education laws is really tricky. And I think everything that's happening at the federal level has a lot of folks questioning, well, what's next? What can I expect and how can I prepare? So let's start with what we're hearing on the ground first. So a little bit of my reporting and my anecdotes here. Last week, I was at a rally in Newark where a lot of educators and teachers were, speaking out against potential federal cuts that could impact schools, education, and students with disabilities, especially services for them. There are a lot of students, at least in Newark, who go to school in ambulances or in oxygen tanks. And if those services are cut or funding is cut for that kind of service, that could have really detrimental effects. So Carolyn, let's go ahead and start with you. Tell me a little bit about what you've heard on the ground from parents and your colleagues as well about potential cuts to this type of funding and restructuring of the federal education department.
Well, it's been quite uproar, quite frankly. So we've heard a lot, and we are following very closely the changes that are happening at the federal level. The first thing I want to say is we have to remember that there's been no change to the law. IDEA still exists, and so families continue to be eligible, or children continue to be eligible for services, and families should operate from that perspective and to continue doing what we've always done to advocate for our children. And I don't think we should lose sight of that. Because it's critically important that we not give up, especially at this point in time. So continue to move forward. The law is in place. Those rights are still in place, and there have been no changes there. That being said, there have been significant changes given what has happened at the U.S. Department of Education in terms of staffing cuts, which have been significant. And it's very disappointing because I think one of the most important things that the U.S. Department of Education has done, and why the potential to fully eliminate it is so scary, is they're responsible for oversight and guidance, right? They issue a tremendous number of guidance documents every year that is very, very helpful in our work. We can turn to those documents and utilize them when we're working with families or negotiating with school districts or whatever is the issue. That's the first place you're going to go. What does the law say? And knowing that there's an enforcement arm available to turn to if things do not go as you would hope. So I think that is understated to some degree, the importance of what is done by having that guidance and enforcement and oversight in place. What we've heard, of course, is that this is all going to be returned to the states to be responsible for that. In fact, the U.S. Department of Education is not that old. So some of us, gray-haired people, remember what it was like years ago when our kids weren't even eligible to go to school, right? And you could show up at the schoolhouse with your child and be told, take them home. We don't have anything here for you. We remember what it was like before there was a U.S. Department of Education and states determined what happened with children with disabilities. And some states did a good job, some really poor jobs of that. And so the department was created because there was a need for this oversight and enforcement. So one of our biggest fears is if we go backwards to that, what will that mean for our children? Primarily, it will make it much more difficult for families to ensure that their children have access to the services that they need and are entitled to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what you raised, that important point that you raised, that the IDEA Act, that act predates the U.S. Department of Education.
Correct.
And it's still enforced and it's still law. Nothing has changed. And for that to even change, that needs to be approved by Congress. It needs to require several levels of bureaucracy. So that still is in place.
That's right.
I think that's important for families to know as well. So thanks for that, Carolyn. Nina, I think a lot of what Carolyn said kind of sets you up really nicely as well, because what you do is you really enforce IDEA. You go to mediations, like you said, you're really making sure that these rights are in schools and are being implemented to students and families. Tell me a little bit about your experience on the ground as well with these families and how you're enforcing these the law to these students and these families.
Well, I just want to also add to what Carolyn said. So New Jersey, we're lucky in New Jersey that our laws go above and beyond what the federal government puts into place. However, I can't over agree with Carolyn about the importance of that federal guidance, especially with so really my focus is on poor and low income people. And as I've mentioned, and Carolyn can agree, there just are not enough attorneys and advocates out there for poor and low income people. So, one of the ways that I can help parents in this in a real practical way is, we write letters for parents, and I'm sure SPAN does well, where we cite guidance. And the federal guidance, a lot of, the state Department of Education, they issue guidance, but they're also short-staffed. So a lot of the guidance that's come out of the federal government have helped my clients in real immediate ways where a district will see, the parent knows the law, is asserting the law. They may or may not. I think a lot of school staff, we think that they know the laws, and a lot of times they don't. You have new school staff coming in, and they have to go through trainings just like everybody else, but they may not know the law. And it really, I would say many times, it can lead to an immediate action on the part of the school by being able to attach a guidance from the federal government. I mean, they're not looking, I'm sure the districts, litigation is expensive and time consuming, mediations take up time. And so that really is going to be a loss to parents who can't afford attorneys. And unfortunately, the school districts do have the power. Parents have the right to appeal, but they have to take that initiative. They have to know how to appeal. They have to have access to the laws. And I think, that while the states, again, the Department of Education, we can rely on state regulations. I think that with the loss of that federal funding, and I can see it now since the pandemic. I think none of us can know for a fact, but we can predict based upon what we've seen since the pandemic and the loss of resources on the schools, teachers, and aides. We can see the increased numbers of parents calling for assistance, increased numbers of children not being having the right services, the right placements, delays in evaluations, delays in classifications, the lack of access to school-based services because they just are not existent, and then parents there are ways to advocate, to try to push schools to get those services, and that's certainly possible, again, if you know how to ask. So 100%, we have to keep on asking, because, you know, if you don't ask, you don't get. And we know as advocates that when you ask, chances are you do get something. And but I think there's been so many more issues. That's why my numbers have increased. And I'm sure that's happening all over the state. Speak to any advocate. And I think there's been much more litigation the parents are filing, because some of those litigations are valid. Sometimes they're not valid because because there isn't, you know, the information out there. But the big message is that there have been the schools are already struggling to provide services, and that a loss of federal funding will be it'll be terrible for children and families that have you know, children with special needs, and their parents who are trying to support them, and families and school staff. It'll be very difficult for school staff to try to address their needs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you said, the services here are going to be strained. That's really important for folks to know. I had, you know, through my reporting, I'd spoken with experts like you two in the past, and they had said that it would take years to really go through, you know, correct litigation, ensure that students are receiving the services they've gotten. And even now, after the pandemic, a lot of students face a lot of academic loss, but students with disabilities were impacted twice as hard. Right. And so let's talk a little bit about the stakes here. Like, what is at stake let's keep the funding aside for a minute, but what is at stake? What is the current kind of landscape of students with disabilities and special education in New Jersey?
If you want to start, I just actually wanted to, sorry. I just want to actually add on to something that Nina said that I think is really, really important, which kind of leads to your question too, in terms of what we saw with the pandemic and the impact on all of our students, but particularly students with disabilities. One of the other cuts that have happened at the federal level is the defunding of the Institute for Educational Sciences, IES, which is the research arm. Those are the folks that are looking at and collecting data and reviewing and analyzing data around student performance and how students are doing. And so I think another major concern that we have is, without an entity looking and analyzing and reporting and sharing that data with us, we won't even know moving forward the true impact of some of these changes. What we do know from the pandemic and the research that has been done since that is that all students fell back some, but certainly students with disabilities had a tremendous amount of learning loss due to the pandemic. Students with disabilities didn't have access to the same technology and other supports that other students have. And so clearly there has been the need to kind of compensate for and make up for the loss that our students with disabilities experienced. And so I just think that it's really important that we remember how important it is to not only collect data, but what are we doing with that data that we collect? And to another point that Nina mentioned around families really having to struggle, and when disputes arise, how do we handle that? So one of the other things that the Federal Department of Education provided was that oversight and that identification of the fact that in New Jersey, we're experiencing severe delays in how special education hearings are handled. We're outside of the required timelines. And so there's been a suit around that issue, but certainly the department has been working to address that issue. we've been working with them. We've got some projects that we're working with the department to improve our dispute resolution outcomes. But again, I think we can't lose sight of the fact that that is happening because someone at the federal level is looking and saying you're outside of what you should be doing here. So again, everything that we are doing, all of the work that we're doing on the ground with families, what we're hearing from families, the struggles that they're having, that Nina's office and certainly here at SPAN, that we are engaging at multiple tables, multiple conversations at both the state and federal level to kind of share what families are experiencing and come up with some solutions. So much of that work is based on the data that is collected by the federal government. And so another tremendous impact with what's happening at the federal level.
And also, you know, that the data is also, you know, what agencies like ACNJ and what SPAN uses to present to our legislators in New Jersey to change laws and improve laws and to get policymakers and stakeholders to focus on an issue. And, you know, without that federal data, I know, you know, we look at it all the time in our office.
Yeah.
Some like a lot of the civil rights data and the performance data, even though it's always behind, you know, a couple of years, but, you know, we really rely on it. And without that data, or if there aren't people who, you know, if there's a loss of funding, a loss of staffing to keep up with that data, it's going to have a real, I think, negative impact on the advocates' abilities to advocate on a bigger level.
Yeah, absolutely. And all these points I think are really important. Like we're not even talking about what's happening in the classroom yet. We're talking about just the services, the law, and the enforcement. And I think to your point, Carolyn, some of our reporters in the Chalkbeat Colorado Bureau, they were reporting about how the Office for Civil Rights, a lot of staff were laid off in that department. And a lot of what that department also does is oversee cases of discrimination against students with disabilities. Now, again, this is not even impacting the academics yet. But let's backtrack a little bit for folks who aren't familiar with the IDEA law and the IDEA Act. Can either of you just chime in and say, what are the basic, protections that that act enforces and provides for students with disabilities?
Want me to give it a go?
Yeah, I always feel like I keep going first. I just wanted to give you the opportunity.
I mean, in sort of in a nutshell, it's a funding statute, but basically it protects the rights of students with disabilities to have a free, appropriate public education, in the least restrictive environment, and to be provided with the appropriate accommodations and supports to enable them to learn and progress towards reasonable, challenging goals. That's the basic statement of the IDEA. That I could go on for an hour, but I don't think you want me to.
That's like a loaded question, I understand. Did you want to chime in to add anything else, Carolyn?
I would have said exactly the same thing that Nina just said. And I would add from our perspective, it is also has that component that ensures that parents are part of the process, right?
Yeah.
They are at the table, all decision making around their children. They have to be participate in that. And so that's not true for students who do not receive special education services. So it's an incredible opportunity for families to engage with educators to ensure that we have the best outcomes for our kids. That's really the long-term goal. And I think the law is very powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. The law is really powerful, but it's up to those who are enforcing it to ensure that the powers are being instilled. And I've seen a lot of that through my reporting. I really am always in awe of the advocates who really fight for these families because the legalities are really tough to understand. And even as a reporter who's, covering this issue, it's challenging for me to understand. And I have to reach out to folks like you to really understand what's happening and how parents can advocate for their own rights. So let's talk a little bit more about these families and some of the challenges, the biggest challenges to accessing services and really understanding their rights. I know you both are really on the ground with these families, but let's talk a little bit about the challenges in understanding and how we get families to understand what is happening currently in this political climate.
Okay, I'll go. So I think that families are scared. Yeah, I was going to say nervous, but honestly, I think it's more than just being nervous. They're afraid. Um, and rightfully so, based on what's happening. Um, but I also think that it's important. The other thing that IDEA provides for us is it requires educational programming that is designed to meet the unique and individual needs of every student. That's what's amazing to me, that no matter how your student presents, we are supposed to be developing, creating, and providing an educational program that meets that individual student's unique needs, no matter what they are. And so I think families need to remember that. Families know their kids best. I know it's sometimes a difficult process to go through. That whole IEP process can be very intimidating. We spend a lot of time. We have two big buckets here. We do universal assistance, we call it, by providing trainings to families. We go into communities, we're all across the state, and we are working with families to help them to understand that law, understand what does it mean to have a free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment, blah, 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 right? And it's pretty basic. What does your child need to learn? How do we work with the school to make sure that they access that? Money, of course, is always a concern, but money is not always the thing that is the barrier. So having those conversations, real conversations about that student, what their needs are, what does this school have? How do we put those pieces together to meet the needs of that student? So training is the kind of first line of defense. And then we provide individual assistance where families can call and ask for information about their individual student, versus when we do a training, it's like, this is what the law says, this is what people should be getting. And oftentimes what we hear is, well, that's not happening for me. And then our responses give us a call, and we can then talk to you about your individual circumstances and give some guidance and support to help families to make informed decisions about advocating for their children.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you want to add something else, Nina?
Well, I mean, it's the parent participation rights. So just so I can give some examples. So I mean, the parent participation rights is why I exist in this field. So we're there to, and SPAN and other advocates, we're there to ensure that the parents' participation rights are, I mean, there's a process. The parents need to be heard, and they need to be, what the treating their children's treating physicians, their perspectives need to be heard. And I think that's what's missing. And again, when we're talking about cuts and in this climate, so when I first started doing this, and maybe it was a different economic times. I mean, there's always been pressures between, districts, between their, right, money is not supposed to be, if a district can't afford something, that's not supposed to be the reason why service is denied. But we're talking about, right, money isn't always the answer. So are you utilizing your resources effectively? Are you collecting data? Are you spending that time to get to know the child? Well, all this time takes training on school staff. It takes, training and time. And if you have less staff, and if you have stressed out staff, and I mean, it's always been the communication piece to parents has always been difficult, but now I know, in the past, so I have been to a lot of IEP meetings. In the past, you would see, I would be in meetings and the team would take, sometimes a meeting will go over 2 hours, and that's a long time. But sometimes that really was what it would take. Now, sometimes you'll see staff. I know that if I'll hear parents will say, the meeting was an hour, and they're kind of really rushing through the meeting, and I think that that's it's partly that the staff Maybe they don't have the time. The parents don't know how to advocate for. There isn't. I see staff not spending the time to explain to parents what their rights are. And so I'm very sympathetic to schools, even though I think that they also, in spite of being sympathetic to schools, they still have a job to do. But I do think it's a community issue. And so when we're looking about like resources and the impact of cuts with already in a very difficult climate, we have more children who need services because of mental health issues, not necessarily even special education, but just maybe sometimes they're not getting those issues, and then they're turning to special education, or that seems to be the only answer, rather than addressing the issues that the children need or the education issues. In terms of how this affects clients, I could think of any number of cases. I mean, this morning I had a call from a parent who her child has obsessive compulsive disorder and ADHD. He's very smart, but these things have plagued him since he's now in 8th grade. This has plagued him since he's been just a little boy. He's getting in trouble in school, and he was told the classic. I don't want to say it's not a correct message. If your child is too smart for special education, but that's just not correct. There are many children who are very smart, and it's because of their behavior-based or emotional-based disorders, disabilities, that they aren't, doing well in school. And now the child finally does have an education plan, but it's not working. And this child is still getting suspended and still getting in trouble for things that are the basis of his disability, which isn't supposed to, happen. And the parent has been just going along because she doesn't want to make waves. And so she's just been accepting the IEPs. She goes to meetings because she's afraid that the school staff will get mad at her or get mad. Somehow this is going to negatively. This is a very common story. And I think she finally called an advocate today and because her child has been suspended several times this year. And she basically was kind of at her wit's end, and she wants to help her child. But this is a story that could be repeated, all over. Now, I think there's so many things, wrong with this approach. I don't know, the school, I think, again, not utilizing their resources. And I don't know if they don't have the resources, or are they just, concentrating on children who need more assistance. But, they certainly didn't really take the time to explain to this parent's rights, and haven't really spent enough time with this child to give this child the right services that he needs and supports. Haven't even really attempted to.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the dangers is that, as pressures build on school with lack of staffing, there's been a dramatic increase in my cases from, again, before the pandemic to now, of kids being sent out of school for mental health issues, parents being asked to pick up their children, informal suspensions, or there shouldn't be, it's not, no such thing as an informal suspension, but just sending a child home who has a disability, long-term suspension, suspending children without a definite board hearing date. And just removing, the answer has been to, which has always happened, but not, I mean, it's just dramatically the increase of cases, I mean, that come across my desk, whether, it's because of claimed mental health issues to the extent that the child is a danger, requiring children to go out for to a PHP, to a partial hospitalization program or psychiatric evaluation. I mean, these things aren't harmless. And a lot of times, there's no clear basis for why the child who's determined this child is a threat. And if a child has autism and acts out. It's not necessarily like, or is having a bad day or is dysregulated. That's not a child who is a danger. That's a child who's just acting in a way that their disability, causes them to act. And, whether these conversations are being had when they require a parent to get their child evaluated by a psychiatrist or have their child at home pending I don't know, I think the laws aren't very clear and but I feel like there is definitely, I don't know, I'd love to hear what, Carolyn's experience, but it's huge numbers. Was not, this was a rare occurrence in terms of the mental health exclusions. Over discipline of kids with disabilities, that's always been an issue. But so, and I do feel it's a lack of mental health resources in the school. I think teacher stress, lack of teacher support, not enough funding or programs for, to make sure teachers are trained.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
You spelled out a lot of points, Nina, but go ahead, finish your thought.
no, that's all I was going to say.
I think what the conversation is really, emphasizing, and what your points are emphasizing, Nina, is really the dire need. The need has grown over the years. The need has been very strained even before the pandemic. The pandemic just really heightened that, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm going to transition a little bit here and move to some of the questions from our audience. But let's talk a little bit about, we've talked about the law, kind of the safeguards, the protections, the need, but what will that mean in terms of, classes and what's going to happen in the classroom? So we have a question from Mari Carmen from the New Jersey Hispano newspaper who says, the federal government has announced cuts in education funding. What will happen to classes for students who need special education? So obviously, we need aides. We need, students who are trained to work with students with disabilities. Let's talk a little bit more about what the cuts could impact academics. Carolyn, do you want to start?
Sure. So what's happened thus far anyway are the cuts have only been to the staffing, but at some point the states could potentially receive a lot less funding. There's a formula, so the impact of that will vary dramatically from state to state. In New Jersey, it will have an impact, not as bad as in some other states, but the reality is there will be an impact if funding is cut. And I think some of the points that Nina just raised only exacerbate that problem in terms of we are already struggling with our students, right? Teachers are stressed, maxed out, stressed out completely. Full disclosure, my daughter is a special education teacher, so I hear frequently from her some of the challenges that they are facing. But a lot of it is just they're burned out emotionally, financially, and kind of at their wits' end. We've also seen a tremendous turnover in school staffing. And that's always difficult, right? We see a lot of turnover within the superintendent realm, but also within the teacher realm. And so people need time to kind of get up to speed. They need mentors. They need the support to become really strong teachers. And so I heard teachers say, I know what my kids need. I'm in that classroom with them every day. I see them. I know what they need. I'm talking to their parents. But I oftentimes don't have the time or the staff or the resources or the tools to meet those needs. And I think that adds to that emotional stress and burnout. Again, I think we have to keep in mind, nothing has changed specifically within the law, but we do know that as dollars get pulled, services will change. One thing that families can do, and we try to support parent leadership development here at SPAN, parents have to be at the table and they have to raise their voices. They really have to be engaged with the school. We have family engagement projects here. We help families to learn how to do that, how to tell their story, how to really be involved in what's happening in the school building. I think over time, school has just taken on and become more and more responsible for more and more things. And I think we're at a tipping point where there's no more room to take on anything else. But educators also have to recognize that they have some work to do in terms of engaging families, right? That's not, that has to be intentional, right? You have to reach out to the community, become a part of the community, speak with families, not just ask for their input, but engage them, get that input, and then act on it. Oftentimes we reach out and we ask questions and we get that feedback, but then nothing happens, right? We don't follow up on it, which ultimately means you're going to stop. You're not going to be able to continue to get that. People will not feel that it's productive for them. So I do think this is a time for schools to think about how they can increase their parent engagement activities. Because it is really going to take a village. We say that all the time, but right, we all have to get on the same page here if we want to be able to respond in the best interest of our children to budget cuts and the reality that services may go away. So just like we do at home, right? If your budget changes, you sit down and you think about, well, maybe we don't need cable anymore, but we have to keep groceries on the table and really make some hard choices. But families should be part of that conversation. I think that is the critical part, that we're not having, not involving them in those conversations and then making decisions without the input of families. So finding ways to engage families, I think, is very, very important.
Yeah, absolutely. Nina, same question to you. Obviously, what will happen in the classroom with potential cuts?
Well, I'm already seeing that. I mean, the impact could be that a student who is supposed to have a special education teacher doesn't have a special education teacher in the classroom, or a student, who could be in the general education setting with an aide, and they're in a really inappropriate self-contained class because this district doesn't have a variety. Well, first of all, maybe they don't even need that kind of setting, but they're placed in a setting and the school doesn't have a variety of self-contained classrooms. So maybe, there were children who are really far below what they need, or a student being pushed to an out-of-district placement. I mean, this happens, on a weekly basis. I get calls. I mean, this isn't like in theory, this is happening all the time. Or a student who, I think that, aides, having well-trained aides, not just, which is very difficult. So just assigning an aide to somebody isn't necessarily the issue. And having appropriately trained teaching staff, special education staff, and also for the children who are in both general education and special education classes. I don't think that that's training. I don't see that the time, and I know teachers are overwhelmed, but the general education teachers aren't getting the training to know how to address the needs of children who may have an IEP but are also taking general education classes. And I mean, the impact of that, if you see it, eventually, what's the goal of this? Is to graduate students and have them be productive students. And unfortunately, also, this is like one of the saddest things for me, having children who really are full of potential and now they drop out of school because, and this is following really years of having their education needs unmet. And now, they're 17, 18, they're not going to graduate, or maybe they're younger and they're so behind in their credits. They've really been a victim of the pandemic, but even maybe before, they were already behind, and there hasn't been attention paid to them. And, we don't talk much about transition services, but, that's a lot of, publicly funded, programs to help children to, all these, training programs that children in special education need. Of, this is, arguably transition is the most important part, but that takes funding and, collaboration with community, with the county schools and other programs and training programs. So I hope, I don't know like the numbers, but we need an increase of vocational programs. So I don't know if that will be impacted. but I just see that there is, there is a greater need to come up with solutions when you have budget cuts, to collaborate with parents. And the only other thing I was going to add that I thought about when Carolyn was speaking was, schools by law are supposed to collaborate with community providers to the extent that it will help the child. And I think that depending upon the district, some districts I find do that very successfully. In other districts, they would rather handle things in-house, or they're reluctant to listen to work with an outside therapist or an outside provider or the CMO. And I think that these, budget cuts, I think is really, hopefully it pushes school district to get beyond that thinking. And to really, because that really does only thing that makes sense. Those institutions, if there's Medicaid cuts, those institutions are going to be impacted. So really the best thing for children is to try to share those resources and to collaborate. And that would be, my hope, that it finally leads to more open collaboration and acceptance, by school districts. I know it happens, but a wider acceptance by school districts to work with community providers.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, all of these issues there's a number of issues that really will affect students and in the classrooms and schools. I'm just going to transition here to our next question as well. We have a question from Urdu News, who's asking about some statistics here. Could you please share how many students with disabilities are currently enrolled in the New Jersey's education system, and how many of them are from immigrant backgrounds or non-English speaking? I can speak for Newark Public Schools since I do write a little bit about them. There's about 40,000 students enrolled in the district, and of those 40,000, about 7,000 in Newark Public Schools are students with disabilities. So do either of you have some statistics statewide? Off the top? No, that's fine. Yeah, I was just putting into perspective again. Yeah.
Someone just said, so I don't want to, this came from an article from AmericanProgress.org. So, because I was looking at numbers, I don't know if this is a report from them based on the numbers of children around the country who receive special education and Title I funding. And according to this, in New Jersey, so I don't know if this is, there were 243,000 approximately children who are served under IDEA.
I think that's about right. We just submitted our application for funding, and so I was going to say it's around 200 to 210,000 children in New Jersey receiving special education services, which is about 15%, I believe, of our student population. So it's a significant number. I don't have the breakdown as to immigrants, but I will tell you we intentionally do a tremendous amount of outreach to reach the most underserved communities and those families that have the most challenging issues, whether it's language access or immigration status or low income. Those are the families that we typically try to reach the most. The IDEA still requires us to serve families with limited English proficiency and those who are low income and those who are underserved. So those are families that we can still really seek out in terms of providing services, even though there are the requirements to delete or get rid of any sort of DEI initiatives. That is still in the statute. And so those are families that we are still seeking to reach and serve. And I just wanted to add another little comment when Nina was speaking before about what happens in the classrooms. Yes, we're already seeing those shortages. I so appreciate you talking about those community based opportunities to serve kids. We already know there's a shortage of speech therapists. So we have to look at other ways to provide those services to children. And one other big concern that we have here at SPAN with what's happening in the classroom are the restraint and seclusion of students with disabilities, where in New Jersey, that is a legal thing to do for students with disabilities, no other students. And so we do a lot of work around that issue. But I think the combination of limited funding, lack of resources, um, high stress levels for families, burnout of teachers. Those are the kinds of things that lead us to using those kinds of tactics, because we don't really have the wherewithal to really address things appropriately. So that is another area that we're extremely concerned about, that it's happening already, but that there could potentially be an increase in the use of restraint and seclusion on students with disabilities as one of the other impacts of budget cuts. So we're keenly attuned to that as well and concerned.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks for that. And I'm going to take one more question from the audience since we're running out of time. Lots of great questions from everybody. Thanks. But I guess one that really stood out to me is, when we talk about different school districts, obviously everyone kind of uses their money in their own way. Will districts that, are higher income, you could say, fare better than those that are lower income if these cuts were to happen?
I would probably say yes. I'm going to just jump in because I know I looked at data. I think it was kids count data that ACNJ, but I know in general, like the learning loss, and maybe that when it was recently reported this year, children from wealthier districts were nearly back to where they were. It was children from poor and low income communities, children with disabilities, who were, I think children with disabilities were even, and also children who were involved with DCPMP. They were really had were still at the lowest level in terms of having made progress, kind of recover that learning loss. And I think that we're going to just really see this, wealth and income, gap. And it's a very different education system for children who are immigrants or poor and low income, particularly those with disabilities. But, and it's going to see a different story. Same thing, I think, with chronic absenteeism. There's been a growth in chronic absenteeism. And, but it's been more, again, not so much the wealthier districts that are impacted by that.
Yeah,
I don't know if you see similar data.
I would agree to the yes answer. We know that our school funding formula is census based, and that has already led to inequitable funding, and your zip code matters, right? And so we already know that. So we can anticipate that would only be exacerbated by these additional cuts. And so unfortunately, I think the answer is yes, that the children that live in the less wealthy districts will be impacted more severely than others. And so, I mean, you could probably do another whole show on the school funding formula, so I won't get into that, but certainly that is a concern.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think we could spend like another hour or 2 or 5 just talking about all the legalities and what's happening and what the impacts are. But just, I guess, one last question just to kind of wrap this up in 30 seconds. Can either of you just tell me just a little, I guess, where parents can find you, where families can find you, and where our journalists can find you?
Well, that's an easy one. So I would invite you all to visit our website at spanadvocacy.org. And check out the resources we have there. Give us a call for any sort of individual assistance that you may need, 1-800-654-SPAN. And we like to think of ourselves as a one-stop for families, right? So if we can't serve you, we will certainly find a resource and connect you to that. Might be Nina at ACNJ. And so that is our goal, to really help families understand the systems across the state that are intended to serve them, give them a voice, and support them in any way that they need to be supported.
And I'm also easy to find at Advocates for Children of New Jersey. You can email me at npeckman@acnj.org. You can call me. Our phone number is 973-643-3876. And, I welcome, the opportunity and to help anyone who seeks assistance or wants information. Welcome to contact me.